She found the cowboy mending his shirt and took the needle from his trembling hands. "Please, just for the boy." The silence that answered was as vast and dry as the plains stretching out behind her. It was a silence baked hard by a relentless sun, a silence that had lived in this place long before the man on the porch and would remain long after he was gone. He sat in the shade of the overhang, a shape of stillness against the weathered gray wood of his cabin, the only vertical thing for miles besides a lone, twisted cottonwood by a dry creek bed. His name was Elias, though she did not know that. To her, he was just a barrier or a deliverance, and she did not yet know which. The dust settled around her worn boots, a fine red powder that coated everything, including the sleeping child on her hip. The boy, Leo, was a dead weight, his small face flushed with heat and exhaustion, his breath a faint puff against her neck. Her own breath was shallow, her throat a knot of desperation. She had walked until the horizon swam and the soles of her shoes had worn thin. This solitary homestead was the first sign of life she had seen since dawn, a plume of smoke rising thin and straight into the merciless blue sky. Elias did not move. He watched her from under the brim of a stained hat, his face a landscape of shadows and sun-creased lines. He had seen them coming for the last hour, a slow-moving speck of misery crawling across his land. His first instinct, the one honed by years of solitude, was to go inside, bar the door, and wait for the speck to pass on by. The world had taught him that other people were complications, their needs like burrs that snagged and clung and were difficult to remove. His peace was a fragile thing, built on a foundation of routine and deliberate forgetting. He had no room for the desperation he saw in the woman's eyes. But he had not gone inside. He had stayed on the porch, a needle and a torn shirt idle in his hands, and he had watched. He watched the way she shifted the boy's weight, the slight stumble in her step that spoke of utter depletion. He saw the fierce, protective set of her jaw. It was a look he recognized. It was a look he had once seen in a mirror, in the reflection from a window pane long ago, just before the silence in his own house had become permanent. Leo stirred in his sleep, a small, fretful sound. The woman, Sarah, instinctively tightened her hold, her body curving around him like a shield. She had said her piece. The plea hung in the air between them, shimmering in the heat. There was nothing more to say. She could only wait for the verdict of his silence. He looked down at the shirt in his lap. The thread was tangled around his thumb. His hands, which could gentle a wild horse and split a cord of wood before noon, felt thick and useless holding the tiny needle. He had been trying to mend a ripped cuff for the better part of an hour, a simple task that had become an exercise in frustration. The tremor in his fingers was a familiar betrayal, a ghost of a past he kept buried under layers of hard work. Finally, he moved. It was not a grand gesture. He simply laid the shirt and needle aside on the worn plank of the porch. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, and walked to the water barrel at the corner of the cabin. The scrape of the tin dipper against the inside of the barrel was the loudest sound for a mile. He filled it with cool, dark water and walked toward her. He did not look at her face. He held the dipper out, his gaze fixed on the parched ground between them. She watched him approach, her body tensing. Every stranger was a threat until proven otherwise. But his eyes were on the ground, and his movements were deliberate, without hurry or menace. When the dipper was within her reach, she hesitated for only a second before taking it. Her hand brushed his, her skin dry and hot, his calloused and cool. She brought the dipper to her son's lips first. Leo drank greedily in his sleep, a soft, sighing sound. Only when he was satisfied did she drink herself, the water a shock of life in her throat. She drank until the dipper was empty and then held it out to him, a silent offering of thanks. He took it and turned back toward the cabin without a word. She thought he was dismissing her, that the water was the beginning and the end of his charity. She braced herself to lift the boy and walk on, to where she did not know. "The barn," he said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. He gestured with his head toward the large, silvered structure 50 yards from the house. "Hay's clean. There's a pump out back. You can stay the night." He did not wait for an answer. He walked back to his chair on the porch, picked up his shirt, and stared at the tangled thread as if the woman and child had already vanished back into the heat haze from which they had appeared. It was an offering given with the least amount of himself possible. A roof, not a welcome. Place, not a connection. But for Sarah, who had expected nothing, it was everything. She looked from the man's rigid back to the solid shadow of the barn. She shifted Leo higher on her hip, and for the first time in a long time, she took a step that was not toward an unknown horizon, but toward a place of rest. The barn smelled of hay and dust and the faint, honest scent of horse. The late afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the wallboards, striping the floor with bars of dusty gold. It was cavernous and quiet. In one corner, a pile of clean, sweet-smelling hay was stacked high. It looked softer than any bed she had slept in for weeks. Sarah lowered Leo onto a thick burlap sack she found, and he immediately curled into a ball, his small thumb finding its way to his mouth. She watched him for a long moment, the fierce love she felt for him a physical ache in her chest. He was the only reason she was still moving, the only reason she had found the strength to ask a stranger for help. She explored the space cautiously. It was well-kept, orderly. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, and harnesses were coiled neatly. The man, for all his silence, was not idle. At the back of the barn, she found the pump he'd mentioned. She worked the handle, and after a few dry, groaning complaints, it brought forth a steady stream of cold, clear water. She drank deeply, then splashed her face and neck, washing away the grime of the road. Felt like a baptism. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, the man appeared at the wide barn door. He didn't enter, just stood silhouetted against the fading light. He carried a lantern in one hand and a folded gray blanket in the other. He set them down just inside the doorway, on top of a wooden crate. "There's bread and some jerky on the crate," he said, his voice still that low, unused rumble. "Don't light the lantern near the hay." It was a command, not a suggestion. She nodded, though he might not have seen it in the deepening shadows. He lingered for a moment, his gaze falling on the sleeping form of her son. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he turned and walked back to the cabin, the crunch of his boots on the dry earth fading into the chirping of the crickets. Sarah waited until he was gone before she approached the crate. The blanket was thick wool, worn but clean. Beneath it was a small loaf of dark bread, a few strips of dried meat, and a red apple, its skin polished to a high shine. The sight of it made her stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd eaten anything other than the last of their stale biscuits. She broke off a piece of bread, her hands trembling slightly, and ate it slowly, making it last. The food was a transaction, she told herself. Payment for a night's shelter. It was not kindness. Kindness was a currency she could no longer afford to believe in. She made a nest for Leo and herself in the hay, spreading the wool blanket over them. The hay was prickly but warm. Through a high window in the barn's loft, she could see a sliver of the night sky, awash with more stars than she had ever seen. They were cold and distant, beautiful and indifferent, like the man in the cabin. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, the sigh of the wind through the eaves, the stamp and snort of a horse in a nearby stall, the steady, rhythmic breathing of her son beside her. She felt a profound and unfamiliar sensation. Safety. It was temporary, she knew. It was conditional. But for tonight, no one was chasing them. For tonight, they had a roof over their heads and food in their bellies. For tonight, that was enough. She finally drifted off to sleep, one hand resting protectively on her son's small back. The days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Each morning, Elias would rise before the sun, his movements economical and precise. He would tend to his 2 horses, milk the lone cow, and then set about the endless tasks that a life of solitude demanded. Mending fences, clearing brush, checking his well. He never approached the barn. Instead, he would leave provisions on the same wooden crate by the door, a small pail of fresh milk, a few eggs, another loaf of bread. He would leave them and walk away, granting her the dignity of not having to accept charity face to face. Sarah, in turn, established her own routine. She rose with the light, washed at the pump, and set about making their small corner of the barn into a temporary home. She was a woman accustomed to work, and idleness felt like a danger. She found a broom and swept the barn floor until it was clean of loose hay and dust. She discovered a small store of mending supplies in an old crate and set to work repairing the threadbare knees of Leo's trousers and the frayed hem of her own skirt. She did not want to be a burden. She wanted to earn their keep, even if the terms of their stay were unvoiced and uncertain. Leo was the bridge between their two silent worlds. After the first day of exhausted sleep, his natural curiosity returned. He was a quiet boy by nature, made more so by their journey, but the farm was a place of muted wonders. He would sit for hours near the barn door, watching Elias work with the horses. He never got too close, maintaining a careful distance, as if he understood the invisible boundaries that surrounded the man. Elias was acutely aware of the boy's gaze. He could feel it on his back as he curried his mare, a small, steady pressure. At first, it unnerved him. The presence of a child on this land was a sharp, painful echo of a life he had locked away. He had a small wooden box on the mantel in his cabin that he never opened. Inside was a whittled horse, its paint worn smooth by small hands, and a faded blue ribbon. He tried to push the memories away, to focus on the familiar weight of the tools in his hands, the smell of the horse, the solid reality of his work. But Leo was persistent in his quiet observation. One afternoon, while Elias was splitting firewood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful arc, he noticed the boy had moved closer. He was sitting on the ground near the woodpile, a safe distance away, with a stick in his hand. He was drawing patterns in the dust, occasionally looking up to watch the swing of the axe. Elias didn't acknowledge him. He kept working, the rhythm of the work a shield. But when he finished, as he was stacking the split logs, he saw that the boy had left something on top of the chopping block. It was a perfectly round, smooth stone. A gift. Elias stared at it for a long moment. He picked it up. It was cool and heavy in his palm. He looked toward the barn, but the boy was gone. He slipped the stone into his pocket. Sarah saw these small, tentative interactions, and her caution warred with a fragile sense of hope. The man was not unkind. He was contained, walled off. She understood walls. She had built a fortress around her own heart to survive. She began to leave things for him in return. One evening, she picked a small bouquet of hardy purple wildflowers that grew near the creek bed and left them in a tin can next to the empty milk pail on the crate. The next morning, the flowers were gone. She found a patch of wild berries and left a small bowl of them for him. When he left the morning's milk, he left a small block of cheese beside it. It was a silent bartering, a language of objects that allowed them to communicate across the divide of their solitude. One afternoon, a few weeks after her arrival, she saw him on the porch again, struggling with the same torn shirt. He was trying to thread a needle, his brow furrowed in concentration, his large fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and the light was poor. He squinted, his shoulders hunched in a posture of quiet frustration. He looked so solitary, so locked in his own struggle, that something in Sarah shifted. It was not pity, but a sense of recognition. The world broke everyone in different ways. His way was this profound, guarded loneliness. She left Leo playing in the barn and walked across the yard. The dry grass crunched under her boots. He heard her coming and looked up, his expression guarded, almost hostile, as if she were intruding on a private moment of failure. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She didn't speak. She simply held out her hand. His eyes flickered from her face to her outstretched palm and back again. He didn't understand. "The shirt," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Let me." He stared at her, his jaw tight. It was a small thing, a torn cuff, but his inability to fix it felt like a larger failing. To hand it over was an admission of that failure, an act of surrender. It was letting her inside his walls, if only by a few inches. He looked at her hand, steady and waiting. He saw the faint scars on her knuckles, the sign of a life that had not been easy. Her hands were capable. He looked at his own, which were trembling almost imperceptibly. With a slow, reluctant movement, he placed the shirt and the needle and the spool of thread into her waiting hand. Their fingers brushed again, a brief, electric contact. She did not go into his house. She simply sat down on the top step of the porch, a few feet away from him, turned the shirt toward the fading light, and threaded the needle on the first try. Elias watched her. He watched the way her fingers moved with a practiced, efficient grace, the needle dipping in and out of the rough fabric. She made tiny, even stitches, her work neat and strong. She was not just patching a hole. She was mending it, making it whole again. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty or tense. It was a shared space, filled with the rhythmic whisper of the needle and thread, and the quiet breathing of two lonely people sitting together on a porch as the sun went down. She was mending his shirt, but it felt as if she were stitching together something else entirely, something deep inside him that had been torn for a very long time. When she finished, she bit the thread, smoothed the cuff, and handed it back to him. The seam was barely visible, stronger than the original fabric. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. She just gave a small, single nod and returned to the barn, leaving him alone on the porch with his mended shirt and the profound, unsettling feeling of having been cared for. He looked at the perfect stitches, a neat line of dark thread against faded blue cotton, and felt a crack appear in the wall he had so carefully built around his heart. The storm gathered on the horizon for 2 days, a slow, brooding accumulation of dark clouds that bruised the edges of the sky. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a restless energy. The birds fell silent. Elias watched the sky with a practiced eye, recognizing the signs of a bad one coming. He spent the day securing the homestead, checking the roof of the cabin, reinforcing a loose shutter, and bringing extra feed and water into the barn for the animals. He worked with a grim urgency, the impending whether a physical manifestation of the turmoil he felt inside. The quiet routine he had shared with Sarah and Leo had been disrupted by the simple act of a mended shirt. That small intimacy had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He found himself watching her more often, noticing the way she moved, the quiet dignity in her posture, the weariness that clung to her like a second skin. He saw her teaching Leo how to skip stones at the creek, her rare smile transforming her face. The sound of her low laughter carried on the wind, and it was a sound that both warmed and wounded him. It reminded him of all that he had lost, and all that he had sworn he would never risk again. On the 3rd day, the sky broke. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a ravenous howl, tearing at the lone cottonwood and whipping dust into blinding sheets. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, driving curtains of water that turned the world to a gray blur. The temperature plummeted. Elias stood at his cabin window watching the barn. The old structure was sturdy, but he worried. He saw the faint, flickering light of Sarah's lantern inside. He imagined her and the boy huddled in the hay, the wind shrieking through the cracks in the walls. The thought was a sharp discomfort. He had offered them shelter, but it was a poor shelter against a storm of this magnitude. Inside the barn, Sarah was trying to be brave for Leo. She had built up the hay around them into a small fortress, but the wind found every gap, and the cold was a damp, seeping thing. The barn timbers groaned under the assault of the storm. Leo was not crying, but his eyes were wide, and he was shivering, whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. She held him tight, singing a soft lullaby, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind and rain. Suddenly, the main barn door, which she had barred from the inside, shuddered violently. A huge gust of wind caught it, and with a splintering crack, the wooden bar shattered. The heavy doors flew open, crashing against the outer walls. Wind and rain exploded into the barn, extinguishing their lantern and scattering the hay. Leo cried out, a sharp sound of terror. In that moment of darkness and chaos, a figure appeared in the gaping doorway, silhouetted against the churning gray sky. It was Elias. He was soaked, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his head. He had to fight to stay on his feet against the force of the wind. "Come on!" he shouted over the storm. "You can't stay here." He didn't wait for her to answer. He strode into the barn, his boots splashing in the water that was already pooling on the floor. He found them in the dark, his hands reaching out. He scooped Leo into his arms, wrapping the boy in his own large, sodden coat. Leo, surprisingly, did not struggle. He clung to the man, burying his face in the rough, wet wool. "Get to the house," Elias yelled to Sarah, his voice a raw command. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the one wool blanket that hadn't blown away. She followed him out into the teeth of the storm. The rain was like needles against her skin, and the wind threatened to knock her off her feet. Elias shielded her with his body as they fought their way across the 50 yards of open ground to the cabin. Felt like a mile. He shoved the cabin door open and pushed her inside, following right behind and slamming it shut against the raging storm. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the frantic pounding of Sarah's own heart. The cabin was one room, dark and Spartan, but it was blessedly still and dry. A low fire glowed in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on the simple wooden furniture. It was the first time she had been inside his home. It felt like crossing a sacred, forbidden line. Elias gently set Leo down on the thick bearskin rug in front of the fire. The boy was trembling, his teeth chattering. Without a word, Elias stripped off his own wet coat and then carefully helped Leo out of his damp clothes. He wrapped the boy in a dry, heavy blanket from the foot of his bed and sat him close to the hearth. Sarah stood dripping by the door, clutching her wet blanket, feeling like an intruder. She watched as Elias moved with a quiet, focused competence. He stoked the fire until it blazed, then put a kettle of water on a hook over the flames. He seemed to know exactly what to do, his movements sure and steady. There was a tenderness in the way he handled the child, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "You're soaked," he said, his back to her. "There's a dry shirt on that peg. It'll be big, but it's better than what you've got." He gestured to a hook by the door where a clean chambray shirt hung. Sarah hesitated. To take his clothes, to be here in his private space, felt like an impossible intimacy. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and she was shivering uncontrollably. She looked at her son, now starting to warm by the fire, his eyes heavy with sleep. For him, she would do anything. She took the shirt and, turning her back to the room, quickly shed her wet bodice and chemise and pulled the man's shirt on. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean cotton. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging down past her hands, the hem reaching her knees. But it was warm and dry. Elias handed her a tin cup of hot, sweet tea. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and this time, the contact lingered for a second longer. She cradled the warm cup in her hands, the heat spreading through her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He just nodded, his gaze on the fire. He sat on the floor next to Leo, one large hand resting gently on the boy's back. The storm raged outside, a wild and violent thing. But inside the small cabin, a fragile peace began to settle. The three of them sat in silence, watching the flames dance, wrapped in a shared circle of warmth. They were three strangers, brought together by a storm, taking shelter not just from the wind and the rain, but from the lonely worlds they had each inhabited. The walls of the cabin seemed to hold out the chaos of the world, and for a few hours it felt like a sanctuary. The storm blew itself out by morning. The world outside was washed clean, the air crisp and cold, the sky a pale, fragile blue. The silence that fell in the wake of the wind's fury was profound. Inside the cabin, Leo was asleep in Elias's bed, tucked snugly under a pile of quilts, his breathing deep and even. He had fallen asleep by the fire, and Elias had carried him to the bed without a word, an act of such simple, paternal kindness that it had made Sarah's throat tighten. She had not slept. She had spent the night in the large wooden rocker by the hearth, dozing fitfully, the man's heavy shirt a comforting weight around her. She had watched the fire burn down to embers and had watched Elias, who sat in a straight-backed chair across the room. His long frame folded into the small space, a silent, sleepless guardian. He had not intruded on her, had not even looked at her for long stretches, but his presence had been a steady anchor in the dark. As the first light crept through the window, he rose and quietly rebuilt the fire, then set a pan on to cook. The smell of frying bacon and coffee soon filled the small room, a domestic scent that felt both alien and deeply comforting. He worked with the same quiet efficiency she had seen in his outdoor chores. He moved as if he had been cooking for one for a very long time. He placed a plate with 2 strips of bacon and a piece of skillet bread on the small table, along with a tin cup of coffee. He gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, feeling shy and out of place. He served himself and sat opposite her. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of forks against the tin plates and the crackle of the fire. The silence was different from the tense, wary silence of their first days. This was a softer, more companionable quiet, born of a shared crisis. "He was scared," she said, breaking the stillness. Her voice was a little rough. "Leo, he tries to be brave, but he's still just a little boy." Elias stopped chewing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze direct. "He did good," he said. It was high praise from a man who used so few words. She took a sip of her coffee. It was strong and black. His father, he would have panicked. He was never any good in a storm. It was the first time she had mentioned her husband. The words came out before she could stop them, a small crack in her own wall. Elias didn't press. He didn't ask questions. He just listened, his expression unchanged. But he reached out and touched the carved arm of the rocker she had just vacated. His thumb traced the smooth, worn wood. "It was my daughter's," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. The rocker. The confession hung in the air between them, a thing of immense weight and fragility. Sarah's breath caught. A daughter. The word explained so much, the sadness in his eyes, the carefully constructed solitude, the small, whittled horse she had glimpsed on the mantel. They were both haunted. They were both survivors of storms, both literal and figurative. Their losses were different, but their pain was a language they both understood without the need for translation. She looked from his face, etched with a grief he had carried alone for years, to her own son, sleeping safely in his bed. A wave of gratitude so intense it was dizzying washed over her. This man, this silent, broken man, had saved them. He had opened his home, his sanctuary, to them. Later that morning, after Leo had woken and eaten, Elias went out to survey the damage. A few fence posts were down, and a large branch from the cottonwood had fallen, but the homestead had weathered the storm well. The barn door was another matter. The wood around the latch was splintered beyond repair. Sarah came out with Leo, and they stood watching as he examined the broken door. "I can help," she offered. "I'm stronger than I look." He looked at her, then at the heavy door, and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. But he didn't tell her to go away. He went to his workshop and came back with a hammer, nails, and a new plank of wood. He set to work, and she stayed, handing him nails, holding the plank steady as he hammered it into place. Leo sat on the ground nearby, collecting the bent nails Elias discarded. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. The rhythmic thud of the hammer was a sound of rebuilding, of setting things right again. When the door was fixed, stronger than it had been before, Elias stepped back to admire their work. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "The cabin," he said, not looking at her. "There's a small room in the back. For storage. It's warm. Better than the barn." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An invitation. He was telling her she didn't have to leave. He was telling her she could stay. Not just for the night. Stay. Sarah looked at the sturdy cabin, at the newly mended barn door, at her son playing happily in the dirt. She looked at this quiet, grieving man who had shared a piece of his pain with her. The world outside this small, protected piece of land was harsh and unforgiving. Here there was a chance for something else. "We'll move our things," she said softly. It was an acceptance. And in that moment, the sun broke fully through the clouds, bathing the entire homestead in a bright, clean light. The move from the barn to the small back room of the cabin was a move of only 100 feet, but it felt like crossing a continent. It was the crossing of a boundary from guest to something else, something undefined. The room was small and plain, containing little more than a narrow cot and some shelves, but it was clean, and its single window looked out over the vast, open plains. It was a part of the house, part of his life. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of routine, a domestic one. Sarah took over the cooking, her skills in the kitchen far exceeding his own basic, functional methods. The cabin, which had been merely a shelter, began to feel like a home. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale air of solitude. She mended all of his shirts, her neat, even stitches a quiet testament to her presence. She insisted on tending a small garden, turning over a patch of hard soil near the cabin and planting the few seeds she had carried with her, along with some she found in his pantry. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that extended beyond the next sunrise. Elias found his own solitude changing. It was no longer a sharp, painful emptiness but a shared quiet. He found himself looking forward to the smell of coffee in the morning, to the sight of her moving about the cabin. He taught Leo how to whittle, starting him on a soft piece of scrap wood. He would sit with the boy on the porch steps in the evenings, their heads bent together in concentration, the man's large, calloused hands guiding the boy's small ones. He was surprised by his own patience, by the welling up of a gentle, protective feeling he thought had died in him forever. Their conversations remained sparse, but they were no longer strained. They spoke of practical things, the weather, the fence that needed mending, whether the deer had been at the garden. But beneath the surface of these simple words, a deeper understanding was growing. They learned each other's habits, the rhythms of each other's days. He learned that she hummed softly when she needed bread. She learned that he always paused by the window at sunset, looking west. They were two solitary trees that had, by some twist of fate, grown close enough for their roots to begin to intertwine. But the world outside their quiet homestead still existed. They were running low on flour, salt, and other essentials. A trip to the town of Redemption, a full day's ride away, was unavoidable. Elias dreaded it. He had not been to town in over a year. He preferred the company of his horses to the judging eyes of other people. The townsfolk knew his story, or parts of it, and their pity felt like sandpaper on his raw grief. Sarah, too, was filled with apprehension. For her, towns were places of danger, of scornful looks and cruel whispers. They were places where men like her late husband's former employer, Mr. Abernathy, held power. But they needed supplies, and Leo needed a new pair of shoes. They set out at dawn in the wagon, the air cool and crisp. Elias sat stiffly on the driver's bench, his hands tight on the reins. Sarah sat beside him, Leo between them. The boy was excited, chattering about the sights they might see, his innocence a stark contrast to the tension that radiated from the two adults. Redemption was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings lining a single main street. As they pulled up to the general store, Elias felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. People stopped and stared. Elias Thorne, the recluse, was in town. And he was not alone. He had a woman and a child with him. Whispers started like the rustle of dry leaves. He ignored them, his face a stony mask. He helped Sarah down from the wagon and then lifted Leo to the ground, his hand resting for a moment on the boy's small shoulder. "We'll be quick," he said, more to himself than to her. Inside, the store was dim and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave Elias a surprised but polite nod. They gathered their supplies in silence, aware of the other customers who were pretending not to watch them. Just as they were about to pay, the bell over the door jingled, and a man strode in. He was well dressed in a dark suit, his face fleshy and smug. Sarah froze. Her hand flew to Leo's shoulder, pulling him closer. It was Abernathy. His eyes scanned the store and landed on her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well, Sarah, I see you didn't get far," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still dragging that boy through the dirt, are you? I warned you what would happen to vagrants and thieves in this county." The word thief hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Sarah flinched as if struck. Her face went pale. "I never stole anything from you, Mr. Abernathy. I only took the wages I was owed." "My wife's locket says otherwise," he sneered. "You ran off in the night. That's a confession in my book." The other people in the store began to murmur, their curiosity turning to judgment. They saw a well-dressed landowner and a woman in a faded, patched dress. It was easy for them to decide who to believe. Sarah stood her ground, her body trembling but her voice steady. "That's a lie." Elias had been standing by the counter, his back to the scene, his entire body rigid. He had lived for years by a simple code. Do not get involved. Mind your own business. Stay apart. The whispers of the town, the casual cruelty of men like Abernathy. This was the world he had retreated from. To engage was to invite the pain back in. But then he heard the tremor in Sarah's voice. He saw, out of the corner of his eye, the way she shielded Leo with her body, a lioness protecting her cub. He saw the smug, predatory look on Abernathy's face. And something inside him, something that had been dormant for years, finally broke free. He turned around slowly. He was not a large man, but his presence seemed to fill the room. His eyes, which were usually distant and sorrowful, were now like chips of cold, hard granite. He did not look at Abernathy. He looked at the other people in the store, at Mr. Henderson behind the counter, at the women with their baskets, at the men who had stopped their conversations to watch. Then he moved. He walked the few steps to Sarah's side and stood between her and Abernathy. He placed his hand on Leo's head, a simple, proprietary gesture that was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. He finally fixed his cold gaze on Abernathy. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was low and clear and carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This woman is with me," he said, "and this is my boy." He let the words settle, letting their meaning sink in. He was claiming them, publicly, unreservedly. "You will address her as Mrs. Thorne," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something dangerous. "And you will not speak to her or my son again. Not now. Not ever. Is that understood?" Abernathy's smug expression faltered. He was a bully, accustomed to intimidating those weaker than himself. He was not prepared for the cold, unyielding force of Elias Thorne. He saw something in the recluse's eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. He blustered for a moment, his face turning red. "Now, see here, Thorne, this is none of your—" "I asked," Elias interrupted, his voice like the scrape of stone on stone, "if that was understood." The threat was unspoken but unmistakable. The entire store held its breath. Abernathy, his courage failing him, gave a stiff, jerky nod. He turned without another word and hurried out of the store, the bell over the door jingling his hasty retreat. The silence he left behind was thick with shock and awe. Elias ignored the staring faces. He turned to the counter, his hand still resting on Leo's head. "Just the flour, salt, and the boy's shoes, Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice returning to its normal quiet tone. He paid for their goods, his movements calm and deliberate. He gathered their packages, took Sarah gently by the elbow, and guided her and Leo out of the store and back into the sunlight. He helped them into the wagon and then climbed up beside them, taking the reins. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward, leaving the whispers and the staring eyes of redemption behind them. He had not just bought supplies. He had made a declaration. He had drawn a line in the dust of that street, and he had placed Sarah and Leo firmly on his side of it. He had walked back into the world not for himself, but for them. The journey back to the homestead was the quietest they had ever shared. It was not an empty silence, but one saturated with unspoken emotion. Sarah sat straight and still, staring at the horizon, but she could feel the warmth of Elias's arm beside hers. He had called her Mrs. Thorne. He had called Leo his boy. The words echoed in her mind, a powerful, resonant chord. It had been a lie, a shield forged in the heat of the moment to protect her. But it had felt, for a second, like the truest thing in the world. Elias kept his eyes on the horses, his knuckles white on the reins. His heart was pounding in his chest. The confrontation had cost him. It had dredged up all the reasons he'd hidden himself away. But a deeper, stronger feeling was rising to replace the anxiety. A fierce, unfamiliar sense of rightness. He had stood for something. He had protected someone. The guilt he carried, the heavy cloak of his past, felt a fraction lighter. When they arrived back at the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in soft, gentle colors. The homestead felt like a haven, a world apart from the judgment of the town. Elias unhitched the horses, his movements as steady and methodical as always, but Sarah saw a new purpose in his stride. She went inside and began to put the supplies away. She did not take them to the small back room. She put the flour and salt in his pantry, next to his own things. She set the new shoes by the hearth to warm. These were not the actions of a temporary guest. They were the actions of a woman building a home. That evening she cooked dinner. It was a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, but it felt like a feast. When Elias came in from the barn, he washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table. Leo, tired from the long day, was already half asleep, his head nodding. After they ate, Sarah put Leo to bed in the small room. When she came back out, Elias was standing by the fireplace. He was holding something in his hands. It was the small, whittled horse from the box on the mantel. He had finally opened the box. He held it out to her. It was worn smooth, its simple shape elegant. "I made this for her," he said, his voice thick with memory. "For Lily, my daughter. She and her mother. There was a fever. Took them both. That was 5 years ago." The story came out in spare, clipped sentences, each word a stone he had carried for too long. He told her how he had blamed himself, how he had shut the world out, how the silence in the house had become his penance. Sarah listened, her heart aching for him. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply stood with him in his grief, her presence a quiet anchor. When he was finished, a profound quiet settled in the room. She reached out and gently took the wooden horse from his hand. "It's beautiful," she said softly. She walked over to the small shelf by the window where Leo kept his treasures. The smooth stone he had given Elias, a bird's feather, a curiously shaped piece of wood. She placed the horse carefully among them. It was not a ghost from the past being put away. It was a memory being invited to live alongside the present. Elias watched her, a look of profound gratitude on his face. He had shared the heaviest part of himself, and she had not turned away. She had taken his grief and given it a place of honor. Later, Leo, who had not been as asleep as they thought, came out of his room. He carried a piece of paper and a small nub of charcoal he'd gotten from the store. He had been drawing. He shyly held the paper out to Elias. It was a child's drawing, simple and direct. It showed a square house with a chimney puffing out a swirl of smoke. In front of the house stood 3 figures. A tall man with a hat, a woman with long hair, and a small boy standing between them. All 3 of them were holding hands. Elias took the drawing from the boy. He stared at it for a long time, his throat tight. He looked from the drawing to Sarah, then back again. This simple piece of paper held a vision of a future he had never dared to imagine. He walked over to the rough-hewn wall next to the fireplace and, using a small nail he found on the mantel, he tacked the drawing up. It hung there, a bright and hopeful declaration in the warm, flickering light of the fire. Family. The seasons turned. The harsh summer sun softened into the golden light of autumn. The small garden Sarah had planted yielded a modest but welcome harvest of squash and beans. The rhythms of their life together became as natural and ingrained as the rising of the sun. The cabin was no longer his space or her space. It was theirs. Her shawl hung on a peg next to his heavy coat. Leo's small, mended jacket hung beside them both. Elias taught the boy how to read the weather in the clouds and how to track a rabbit. He showed him which plants were good to eat and which were poison. These were not just lessons in survival. They were the passing down of a legacy, the weaving of the boy into the fabric of the land. The sound of Leo's laughter, once a rare and startling thing, became a common music in the quiet yard. Sarah, in turn, brought a gentle order to their lives. She filled the cabin with the smells of cooking and the quiet industry of her mending. She learned the land from Elias, and he, in turn, learned from her a quiet language of care he had long forgotten. They still spoke little, but their communication was deep and constant. A shared look across the dinner table, the way he would leave a pile of perfectly split kindling by the door for her each morning, the way she would leave a hot cup of coffee on the porch rail for him when he came in from the fields. These were their conversations. The wooden rocker, which had once been a silent monument to grief, was now a part of their daily life. Some evenings, Sarah would sit in it, her mending in her lap, the gentle creaking a peaceful, rhythmic sound. Other times, Elias would sit there with Leo on his lap, telling him stories not of people but of constellations, of the habits of coyotes and hawks. He was slowly filling the vessel of his past loss with the warmth of a new life. From the hard, unforgiving soil of his loneliness, something resilient and beautiful was growing. It had not been planted with grand promises or passionate declarations, but with the steady, daily work of two people choosing to stand together against the silence. It was nurtured by shared meals, mended fences, and the innocent, hopeful drawing of a family tacked to the wall. One evening, the first snow of winter began to fall. It came without wind, a soft, silent descent of white flakes that slowly blanketed the dark earth. The world grew quiet, muffled under the growing layer of snow. Leo was already asleep, snug in his bed, the wooden horse on the nightstand beside him like a tiny guardian. Elias stood on the porch watching the snow fall. The flakes caught in the light from the cabin window, a swirling, gentle chaos. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This land, which had once been the site of his exile, the place where he had come to serve out his sentence of grief, now felt like a sanctuary. It was home. The cabin door opened softly behind him. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, pulling a thick shawl around her shoulders. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder just brushing against his arm. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the snow transform the landscape, making it clean and new. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. It was a small, simple gesture, an anchor. He looked down at her hand, then slowly covered it with his own. Her hand was small and warm inside his large, calloused one. Fit perfectly. They stood like that, their hands clasped together, watching the snow fall on their home. The light from the window cast their long shadows onto the fresh white ground. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. The drawing of the three figures holding hands was illuminated in its warm glow. A home was not a place you found on a map. It was not a structure of wood and stone. It was a quiet promise. It was a space cleared in the wilderness of a lonely heart, a place you were finally allowed to rest, a place you were asked without words to stay. She stayed.